G'day everyone, Dicko here with my first Blender tutorial. As you 3D fans out there might know, Blender 2.8 is right around the corner. So I thought this would be the perfect time to create something awesome with Blender's iconic default cube. Now usually the first thing people do with this thing is delete it, but I figured we can try and make something awesome with it, without directly editing its geometry. Now this is more of an intermediate skill tutorial, so if you're not familiar with Blender's feature set, this might be a bit intense. But for those who are looking to skill up on their visuals, this is the video for you. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is create a new blank texture to paint on. I set mine to be 2048 by 2048 pixels. Save that to your project folder, then link that up to the material that's been assigned to the cube in the shader editor. Once that's done, you can switch over to texture paint mode and begin to paint directly onto the geometry. Now it's a good idea to know what you want to create beforehand and gather some reference, so I found some Aztec carvings online to replicate. As you can see, I've switched on mirroring to save time on painting. Since this is a symmetrical design, it's going to save me a ton of time. Furthermore, since I'm a lazy prick, I'm only going to paint one face of the cube, then replicate the face in Photoshop onto the other sides of the cube. At the same time, I'm also being conscious of where I'm placing my highlights, shadows, and midtones in the painting. Because I plan on converting the basic diffuse map into other texture maps such as displacement maps and possibly normal maps in Photoshop. These highlights will therefore be interpreted as high points in the displacement, whilst the shadows will be interpreted as dips in the mesh. The midtones, of course, will represent the average depth of the mesh once displaced. Once I'm happy with the detail I've put into the image, I'll save the texture, then open it in Photoshop. A simple copy-paste job will replicate the face across the cube, lining it up with the UV map that I've also exported from the UV editor. If I were being picky, I would be conscious of which direction I want each face to sit on each side of the cube. But since I'm effectively going to see only two sides of this cube, I really don't give a shit. Having saved the image as a new file, I need to relink my material to that image. A few more touch-ups and we're ready to move on. To add more stone texture to my material, I've jumped over to texturehaven.com to source some free textures to mix in with my painted face. But before we get to that, I'll quickly add a ground plane for my cube to sit on. Once I've done that, I'll jump into sculpt mode with dynamic topology turned on in the tool settings, then quickly sculpt in some hills. Once done with that, I jumped back into object mode and selected my cube to start editing my material. Here's a final look of my node setup if you wish to copy it. As you can see, I used the normal maps from Texture Haven to add more grit to my design. Here's the time lapse of me creating that node setup. I also added a color gradient to the overall rock texture by separating the X, Y, Z coordinates of the cube, then fed that into the color ramp node, then mixed it back into my original painted design. We will talk about how I approached this displacement in a sec, but first I took some time to tweak my light setup. As you can see, I also added an HDRI as an environment texture in the world settings. I also enabled depth of field in my camera and used an empty object as my focal point. I'm now using a new cube to sculpt in what will be my mound of moss that sits on top of the cube, using dynamic topology. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to prepare the moss for a hair particle system by creating a vertex group and weight painting the top with 100% weight. I then add a new hair particle system, then set up some basic materials. One for the moss, using the new principled hair shader, and one for the dirt, using the default principled hair shader. I assigned the hair with the moss material. Here's the hair settings I used to achieve the mossy look. Now it's just a matter of tweaking the moss material to have a fresh, vibrant feel to it. To pad out the rest of the scene, I duplicate my moss patch around the ground plane. I keep one of my views set as the camera view so I can get a sense of the framing. Now let's move on to the displacement. In the shader node setup, I've simply taken my original face texture, converted it to black and white, then fed it into the new displacement node, which in turn is linked to the material output. Make sure that in your cycles render settings that you have enabled the experimental feature set. At the same time, add a subdivision modifier to your cube and set it to adaptive subdivision. Adding a bevel modifier before the subdivision will help the cube maintain its form. Next up, I added some additional pebbles. For the material, I used Texture Haven images, along with combining them with the color ramp. At first I tried using noise textures for the normal maps, but I wasn't happy with the result. Here's the node setup for your reference. Here's a brief time-lapse of me experimenting with the materials. I decided that it was better to add some more moss to these rocks, so I replicated the method I used for the original moss setup. For the dead leaves, I sourced some suitable leaf images online, then removed any background color in Photoshop so they would have an alpha channel. I also created a normal map. I then imported the leaf image as a plane, and then tweaked the material settings by mixing with a transparency node. I then went into edit mode, then cut out the leaves using the knife tool. I then separated these leaves into individual objects and placed them into a new collection. I created a new hair system for the ground, then used the new collection as an instancer, then played with the settings and the original leaf orientations to get it to a state I was happy with. After a few light tweaks and some more moss placements, I was ready to begin rendering my image. I wanted to add a few post-production effects to my image, so I made sure to enable a few render passes in my scene settings. Once I rendered out my image, I jumped into the compositor. Make sure to enable Use Nodes in the compositor. In the end, I only needed to use the Z-depth pass, which I used to create some blue mist, along with some light lens distortion for added effect. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed this quick breakdown and look forward to seeing what you can achieve with a simple little cube as a focal point. If you want to see more cool tricks, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Catches! In the end, I only needed to use the Z-depth pass.